innovation and digital economics and AI. Now, before we start, we of course have a few rules, but luckily the rules simplify down to one rule, which is to be nice. We have a code of conduct which says be nice. We are going to be on video projected to the rest of the world, i.e. be nice. And think about those people on Zoom when you ask questions and use a mic. Now, just because we're such a big crowd, innovation's already done introductions and digital will be doing introductions tomorrow. And what we're going to ask you to do if you've got a question is to go up to that mic, just say your name, where you're from, and then ask your question. And I'm going to encourage, sometimes senior people are like, can I be bothered to stand up at the mic? And the answer will be yes. So without further ado, let's get started on the program. Thank you, everyone.
Is that for me or for Catherine?
Very good. So we're delighted to start with Martin Braha and Noam Yukman's paper.
All right. Hi, everyone. I'm Martin. This is John Work with Noam Yukman, my longtime co-author, and thanks to the organizers for putting the paper in the program. And I'm going to be talking about the process of growth at the resource frontier. And you'll see, I mean, I don't have any fireworks today for you, like in the model, in the empirics. I'm basically just going to tell you some stories. I think those stories don't quite fit some grand narratives that we have in political economy and in economic growth. And then I'm going to show you a formalization of this process that I think captures some of the stories and talk through some of the implications. There. So I'd say that much of human progress comes from innovations that expand the frontier of usable resources for economic use. So think of, historians divide eras by the materials that arose during those eras, from the Stone Age to the Bronze Age to the Iron Age. More recently, if you think about mining and drilling technologies, these are technologies that brought into economic use fossil fuels and turned those into sources of energy. During the 20th century, we can think about communication technologies that made or turned the electromagnetic spectrum into a vehicle for radio and TV broadcasting. And then in recent decades, we had information technologies that turned data into either consumer behavior predictions or training for artificial intelligence. And maybe the next expansion of the frontier will be either in space or into the deep sea in looking for new resources there. And now, this was, to us, the key realization in the paper, that when you think about resources outside the frontier, a distinctive feature of those resources is that property rights, so who owns them, how they can be used, are typically poorly defined. And whereas for resources that are already within the frontier of use, you have established ownership, they trade in markets, there's a price, people can buy them, sell them. But when there's innovations that expand the frontier and bring resources that had previously been overlooked or inaccessible prior to those innovations that reveal their value or brought them within reach, then for this type of resources, it hadn't really been worthwhile or even possible to establish ownership and detail every possible contingency on how those resources could be used. This is an idea that goes back to Denset, in this case just applied to the concept of innovations and resources. And so there's really no market for these resources nor an established price. Okay? Now, if you believe this, then what we really document is just put together some stories, and in the paper we go in more detail than what I'm going to do today. But in important historical cases, what we've seen is that the innovators went in and appropriated these resources that were outside the frontier in anticipation of extraordinary rents. And in turn, this appropriation triggered conflicts with counterparties that had some competing claims. And so let me give you just some examples of this. So this is the AI, digitization and AI group. So the first one I'm going to talk about are generative AI and digital ads. So if you think about Gen AI, what the companies did, of course, beyond the algorithms, a key innovation was the realization that we could use online text as training data. Okay, that's a conceptual leap. I'm going to think about that as an innovation. And what these companies did was to scrape and use this online text under, I'm going to say, quote unquote, fair use, that's the debate, and use it as training data. And in turn, now we're seeing dozens or hundreds of lawsuits and by publishers and authors claiming that their rights have been violated. And I'm not a lawyer, I'm not going to have anything to say about that, but eventually these things will be settled and property rights will emerge out of those litigations. If you go back in time, think about the prior generation of prior technologies, so platforms that figured out, like Google or Facebook, that figured out how to monetize and social media or search by collecting, aggregating, and monetizing user data and selling ads. Right? Again, we've seen a lot of that. In that case, the contests were over who owns this data, can it be sold, can it be bought, and questions of privacy as well. And we've seen tons of litigation as well as regulation that, by and large, I would say, validated and legitimized the initial appropriation of user data by these companies. You go back in time, and I'm going back in time with the same examples that I gave you before. If you think about radio broadcasters, the early radio broadcasters, once we understood, the spectrum was always understood as being important, but it wasn't really commercialized in any way. Radio broadcasters came in and basically appropriated frequencies to transmit radio, and eventually, as more and more of the broadcasters started doing that, it led to interference. And as a result, in this case, it was the government that came in and said, no, now we own the spectrum and we're going to license it to you, and that led to the Radio Act of 1927. In the case of crude oil, the early prospectors, and here the conflict is quite interesting, they would start draining reservoirs that would cross property lines. So the question was, the conflict was, and that hadn't been really specified before, who owned that oil that you drained from a reservoir that was in the property next to you? And through several landmark cases, eventually the US came up with what is called now the rule of capture that allowed that type of extraction from, and said basically whoever gets it owns it. So hopefully this convinces you that at least these cases are and I think these are important technologies of the last century or more that illustrate defining features of this process of growth at the research frontier. That there's an innovation that turns productive and overlooked or inaccessible resource with poorly defined property rights. The innovators appropriate that resource in anticipation of rents, and that leads to some sort of conflict through which property rights eventually emerge. So now the question that you had in your mind, and we did have it too, is that, are these just colorful anecdotes? And which then gives rise to three primary empirical questions. I would say this is how I would judge the paper, okay, if we can answer these questions. And the first one is, and sorry, I'm not going to answer these questions fully in this paper. I think this is kind of like the first step into getting to this. Each of these questions would be a separate paper, I would say, to do it well. So the first one is the expansion of the research frontier systematically associated with appropriation and conflict, or were these kind of like one-off examples? The second one is, are appropriation rents economically meaningful, or are more traditional rents that drive innovation that really the important thing? And lastly, is expansion of the frontier quantitatively important for economic growth, or more traditional Romerian innovations, process innovations? Is this really what's important for growth and not this type of innovations that I'm talking about here? So today I'm going to talk about the first two, and then maybe over the comments I can talk about the third one, which is the one that we do least well on. And because I don't have good ideas on how to do it so far. But I think the first one we do quite well on. So is expansion of the frontier systematically associated with appropriation and conflict? What we thought about doing here was not to focus on particular technologies, but instead focus on classes of resources, immaterial, immaterial, and digital, that came into economic use during the last century, over almost two centuries. And then we looked at US law reviews, the 10 leading US law reviews, to see whether, the law reviews were mentioning that particular resource in a particular class, like the spectrum or data, and whether the conflict that those law reviews were discussing was really about appropriation or something else, like antitrust, for example. And what you see in this graph is basically these sort of waves of conflict that come in together as the frontier expands from material to immaterial into digital. So that, and I think this underlies sort of the key theme of the paper, that it really the expansion of the frontier seems to be systematically associated with appropriation and conflict to some extent. Now, the second question that we have, well, are these appropriation rents important or not? And this is a terribly hard question. What we did was, but in some cases we can use some existing evidence to at least get a sense of magnitudes, and that's what we did here. So let me just talk about radio broadcasting, where there's some evidence that comes from the fact that the FCC in 2017 asked some of the broadcasters that had originally been allocated frequencies for free to sell back those frequencies to the FCC so that they could allocate them somewhere else. And in that case, there's a price in that auction for that frequency that was allocated for free, say, 60 years in the past. And with those numbers, you can come up with a number that says that 2/3 of the earnings for these broadcasters came from those frequencies that were allocated for free, and not from whatever they generated afterwards through selling of radio ads, basically. And you can do something similar with digital advertising when comparing the prices of targeted ads versus prices for ads that cannot do targeting because they cannot be tracked. Okay, so hopefully I convinced you that this has been happening in history. There's a phenomenon here. And what I'm going to claim now is I don't think these observations fit neatly into the two grand narratives that we have in political economy and growth. So first, property rights were not a precondition for innovation here. In fact, they emerged as a consequence. Second, the ambiguity in property rights really created opportunities for appropriation and rents rather than being a hindrance. And that appropriation was really intertwined with the process of innovation and value creation. These were the same people that did both. They both made innovation and appropriated the resources. So the appropriation was not really either purely redistributive or extractive, which has been the focus of much of the literature on the political economy. And on the economic growth side, I would say, most theories, at least all theories that I know of economic growth, rely on some form of monopoly rents in production to incentivize innovation, either through patents, trade secrecy, or else. And whereas here, it's a separate source of rents that can drive innovation, which are rents from successfully appropriating a resource. And that can drive innovation. And so if you believe that, then what I'm going to do next is show you a model of growth at the resource frontier. And philosophically, my goal was to keep it as close as possible to something that we all know and love, and just do a minimal but conceptually important departure so that we can really see the difference. And I'm going to build on standard models of expanding varieties, with the key difference that here innovators will discover and appropriate new resource varieties with poorly defined rights and turn them into new input varieties. Whereas in the standard Romer model, the innovations also generate new input varieties, but these are produced using known resources that already trade in markets and have well-defined property rights. Okay, and that's going to give us a lot, actually. And so, how long do I have, Ben?
7 minutes.
Perfect. And so, the first part of the block is very similar to Romer, the lab version of the model. So, innovators will discover uses for previously unrecognized resources. The technology for doing that is this one over here, this linear technology, where they can use all existing resources to create new resources or discover new resources. And each resource variety J, each discovery creates a resource variety J and an input variety J that uses that resource in production. And before discovery, these resources do not trade, so they have poorly defined rights, and ownership is not established. And so the innovator is faced with the choice of whether they should appropriate which will lead to conflict, or to try to contract with potential counterparties. And I haven't talked about this, but in fact, in some historical cases, we do observe this type of contracting, even for innovations that expanded the research frontier. An interesting one is plastics. So in the discovery of plastics, one of the leading figures there was DuPont. And DuPont didn't really go in and to produce plastics, what you need is oil refinery waste. Obviously, DuPont didn't go in and just took the oil refinery waste from the oil companies. The way that it worked there was actually through contracts, and in particular some form of vertical integration with Conoco, which is one of the most famous examples. And and the reason why they did that is obviously because in that case, the property rights were sufficiently well defined that they couldn't just go and steal the oil waste from Conoco. Even if Conoco was not using that waste at all, they didn't have any use for it. All right, so if the innovator could go in and appropriate the resource and then risk a challenge by a counterparty, or the innovator can recognize the claim of the counterparty and pay for the resource. That's the contract. The property rights are established. Once that happens, the resource trades at the competitive price queue. Production takes place, and there's a markup over the marginal cost, in this case of the resource, and which can capture monopoly rents. And then the final output is just aggregating all the inputs that were produced using these resources, and there's market clearing in the resource market. A feature here that is important is you see that the resources that we're talking about are really rival or somewhat excludable, which are going to be different than ideas, and we can talk more about that offline or during the discussion about how I see the difference between resources and ideas. And all right, so what happens how do we model this conflict? So imagine that the innovator goes in and appropriates the resource, and a counterparty learns about this appropriation at rate delta. And if it does, then they dispute the appropriation, and then this goes to the court or to regulators or society or somehow, or sometimes in history this has been through coercion and violence and war. But then the innovator may win the dispute with some probability theta, and otherwise, if they lose ownership and have to pay some damages or a penalty new. The key parameter here is really this, well, all of them, but in particular theta, which captures the extent to which, let's say, this is about, these are court cases, where there's already precedent that says that actually, if we went to court, then the dispute go in favor of the innovator or would go in favor of the counterparty. And for instance, in the case that I mentioned of plastics and Conoco, it's obviously that theta was very close to zero. So that if this went to the court, then DuPont would surely lose. And in the case of generative AI, I think different people in the audience will have different views on this. I was talking with Kevin Bryant before. I think he feels that theta is pretty close to 1, but I don't know if that's true. And all right, so what this gives you is that, if you just compute the value of this route of conflict, you get the traditional rents by profits in the product market. But this additional source of rents that comes from the expectation of successfully appropriating the resource. So if you do, you get the full value of the resource queue, and the minus here is accounting for the fact that it takes time for the dispute to take place and the counterparty to realize, and that you may lose the dispute in expectation. Okay, so that's one. And if you contract, we're going to do it in a very simple way, and there's more complicated ways that we talk about in the paper. So if the innovator just recognizes the claim of the counterparty, then we're going to assume that the recognized owners behave competitively, so the price of the resource is just the competitive price. So and we do that for 2 reasons. Well, mainly one, that once you do that, then the only source of rents for innovation come from the product market, the traditional monopoly rents. So the model in the case of contract really it's isomorphic to the Romer model. Okay, it's exactly identical. And so for comparison, I think whether innovation really it's a Romerian innovation, or it's an innovation that expands the resource frontier, but property rights are sufficiently well defined that it doesn't lead to appropriation and conflict, is irrelevant for innovation and growth. Those innovations are isomorphic. Now, you may worry, no, in many cases, actually, this assumption of the owners behave competitively may be wrong. In particular, there's few people that are owners or potential claimants of the resource. So we go to the, instead think about a bilateral bargaining situation where the innovator needs to contract with one counterparty. And, okay, great. And so we can talk about that, more of that later. 1 minute? Okay, so if you solve the model, you can characterize when conflict arises and the growth rate in the balanced growth path. And so let me just talk through the implications. So the first is that property rights emerge as a consequence of innovation. So whereas the standard view is that secured property rights are a precondition for innovation, whereas here the firms innovate precisely because the rights over the resources outside the frontier are poorly defined. And in fact, there's a period 1 over delta where the property rights remain ill-defined. The second one is that appropriation rates can sustain innovation. So even here, for instance, suppose you are in a competitive market with no monopoly rent, innovation still happens simply because of the appropriation rents. Now, this is not to say that those monopoly rents are not important, although in the case of broadcasting, it seems to be only 1/3 of all. And also, this is not to say that weak property rights are good for innovation. In fact, it's about poorly defined property rights, which is very different. In fact, the innovators here expect very strong enforcement of the property rights after the resolution of the conflict, so that can give the appropriation, the rents for appropriation. And lastly, if you think about, appropriation is usually seen as redistributive or extractive and separate from or at odds with growth. Whereas here, you can simulate the model, and actually growth at the frontier often comes together with appropriation and conflict, and it's not incidental to, but actually intrinsically linked to it. And I think that can, interpret some of the legal conflict waves that we've seen in the past. So let me just end with this, and given that I'm out of time. So there's an old idea in this paper, which goes back to the Enlightenment, really, and Descartes, and that economic growth comes from the mastery of nature. And the language that we're using is more modern economics language, not philosophy, which is that innovations expand the frontier of usable resources. And it also goes back to Mokyr, and Descartes talked about masters and possessors of nature, and Mokyr talks about the knowledge of nature directed to productive ends. I think the new idea here is that the mastery of nature and the growth that comes from that, the resources there really invariably have poorly defined property rights. And as a result, the mastery of nature, innovation, and growth that expands the frontier often comes with appropriation and conflict. And so I think the questions to argue about is, well, how systematic this is. Does conflict cause the emergence of property rights? Didn't show you any evidence of that. And then policy. So how to trade off growth from permissive appropriation against its cost. Innovative strategies to influence courts or regulators. We go to some length in the paper, but I think much more work to be done on that. Okay, thank you very much.
All right, thanks so much to Ben and Heidi for inviting me to discuss this paper. It's a great paper. I really enjoyed having the chance to engage with it. And so overall, I think this paper makes a really novel and an important contribution. I teach economic growth to undergrads, and we emphasize over and over again property rights are important for investment and economic growth. You need well-defined property rights. And this is showing an example where actually, and an important example, where poorly defined rights can actually sometimes generate innovation in CITIMs by creating opportunities for appropriation, rather than impeding innovation, which is the story that we tend to emphasize. And it also contributes to standard growth models by showing a channel beyond the traditional monopoly rents that can incentivize innovation. And so I think the real strengths of this paper are, first of all, that it's really ambitious, and I really value that. It links, it's ambitious in its topic, and that it's talking about frontier innovation, contested ownership, long-run growth, all kind of big picture important questions. It's ambitious in the evidence that it brings. It has case studies, it has empirical evidence and theory. It's ambitious in the questions, it treats, it develops the theory, it talks about welfare, about political economy. It's broadly applicable, so the examples are just fascinating. We have everything from oil in the 19th century to AI today, and it's parsimonious, so it makes one targeted departure from standard expanding variety models, and we get really clear new insights from that. And I find the main channel that it emphasizes fairly compelling, that innovation can make resources newly valuable, and because the rights are poorly defined, you can get returns from appropriating them, and that's going to create higher expected private returns to innovation. I think that the paper's greatest strengths are kind of also what I jumped off of in thinking about, what might be able to be strengthened. And I think the challenge is it's just so broad and it's doing so much that if they wanted to really do all of this well, you need a book, you need an entire agenda. And so I wanted to focus on a few of the areas that I think could either maybe be further developed or maybe become their own separate paper, or otherwise, maybe even de-emphasized a bit to make space for developing other parts of the paper. And so the first thing I want to talk about wasn't even really mentioned in the presentation. I just had, I was at a talk earlier this morning where it was the same thing, to discuss and focus the whole time on something that the author didn't have time to get to. But it does play an important role kind of in the paper, and I think in what we should care about, which is what are the welfare effects of these kind of poorly defined rights. And I think that here it becomes kind of more difficult to use such a simple and parsimonious model, kind of to think about this seriously. And of course, those welfare effects are also important for thinking about policy and political economy. And so kind of an important simplification in the paper is that there's just one type of resource, right, in the theory. But in the case study evidence, we see that there's kind of very, very different types of resources that the model is then applied to. So you have oil, which is it's rival, it's exhaustible. You have the spectrum. A key feature of the spectrum, and this comes up in the case study discussion, is that it's congestible. The use of one innovator kind of impedes another. And then finally, you have things like data and text for Gen AI. And this is largely non-rival, reproducible. And when we think about welfare with these different types of resources, very different things are going to sort of come to the forefront. And so just to elaborate a bit, essentially the paper's baseline is a rival, non-depleting unit service flow. And so there's no resource stock loss. So with oil, we might think, well, an important part of the welfare effects of having poorly defined property rights initially is that there's these races towards extraction, there's duplication in investments for extraction, and that can be kind of really important to what we think the overall welfare effects are. Yes, it creates an incentive to innovate and to be able to get the oil out of the ground quickly before these property rights become better defined, but then the stock might be exhausted quickly. If we think about the spectrum, in the case of the paper's model, productivity is independent of other users' activity. Whereas in the case study evidence, kind of the key point that's emphasized is interference and crowding. And that's why the government decided to come in and regulate this in the first place. And that's going to be important to thinking about the welfare effects. So maybe the fact that the property rights are poorly defined means you get more people in there experimenting, but you can't listen to the radio because the signals are all interfering with each other. I think that this comes through in a big way when we think about Gen AI or targeted advertising. And so there's no simultaneous use or reuse. There's no kind of separate upstream creation or disclosure decisions. No differential downstream access. And so I want to elaborate a bit on this point, which is, I think, a kind of a second point where it makes it a bit difficult to think about what are the welfare consequences of these kind of poorly defined property rights initially. And so the paper really focuses on the frontier application, like the center part of this chain, But depending on the resource, we might also have upstream creation or discovery, so who creates, maintains, discloses, supplies the resource. And then we also have downstream effects, so who can access the resource or who can build upon it for further innovation. And the model varies who owns the resource, but not kind of the various obligations, permissions that come along with that ownership. And so we can't think about things like licensing or access, compensation, use rules, through which kind of the property right can affect both upstream creation and downstream follow-on innovation and reuse. And again, I think this is like the model is doing the right thing for focusing on that private incentive channel by keeping it really parsimonious. But when we think about welfare, these things become important. And so I'd say, you know, the discussion around generative AI, AI search right now is very much focused on these upstream effects, on the resource creation and supply. And so in the model, each resource variety exogenously provides one unit of service at every period. The counterparty can claim it, but they don't choose whether or not to create, maintain, or disclose it. And this is a really big, important part of the policy debates that we have over property rights over data, right? Downstream is also important. So in the case of the model, a representative final goods firm purchases each input at a given price, and you don't have issues like downstream entry, you know, follow-on R&D, and of course there's a big literature showing that follow-on R&D can be important, again, potentially depending on what that resource is. And so I think the model, you know, does the right thing for focusing on kind of the private incentives to innovate, but if we want to talk about welfare and policy, I think you'd have to kind of expand it in various ways to think about these important cases, or maybe limit to a kind of a more limited set of frontier resources. Another small point that I wanted to make kind of about the framing of the paper before I talk about empirics is I think one thing that this paper highlights is that all the time we'll say things like property rights. But oftentimes what we mean is not necessarily like the property right over a given resource, but more property rights institutions. Is there credible adjudication? Is there predictability? Is there effective enforcement? Does the system have the ability to adapt as new uses emerge? Which is very different from a property right over a resource. And I think the literature has maybe been a little bit careless in talking about these things interchangeably. And the paper highlights where really it's the combination of this initially unresolved resource-specific right with credible eventual resolution and enforcement that can motivate frontier innovation. And so I think this is an important contribution. In talking about how this contributes to the related literature, I think it's important that the paper also kind of carefully distinguish between these two things because, you know, as it highlights, they can be different. All right, so I want to spend a few minutes talking about the empirics. As I said, the paper's doing a lot. It has a model, it has welfare, it has political economy, and then it tries to answer these three big empirical questions as well. I don't think it can do all of this in one paper, so this is more to suggest some things that might be feasible within this paper and some other things that would make interesting kind of follow-up research. And so the first question it asks, which is I think the one it's able to answer the most convincingly, is the expansion of the resource frontier associated with appropriation and conflict? And it does an exercise with law review journals over a long period. It looks for certain keywords. I think this is compelling. I think it could be strengthened in kind of various straightforward ways. And so the first thing is to show more about the measurement validity. Hand code a representative sample, report the precision and recall, and beyond that, that would allow you to estimate unbiased coefficients and confidence intervals. So this is like one of my things whenever I see people use an LLM or a keyword search to analyze text, I want to see confidence intervals on it. Robustness. I think it would be good to see robustness both to the construct definition, so you use particular keywords kind of to capture these appropriation conflicts. Is it robust to changing the definition of that? Would it be possible to use an LLM-based coding exercise? Just standard robustness things, but that I think are important. And probably the biggest critique that people may have is you're focused on law review articles, and I understand you do that because they're readily accessible and comparable over a long period of time, but of course they capture more like scholarly attention versus conflict incidents per se. So I think to the extent that the data can be accessed, it would be nice to kind of supplement this with things that are closer to disputes, like the text of court opinions, agency decisions, statutes, regulatory orders, litigation filings. I know all of this is probably not available, or it would be some giant OCR project, but to the extent that there can be some additional evidence, I think that that would be useful. Okay, the second empirical question is, are appropriation rents economically meaningful? And I think the calculations that the paper gives are consistent with large rents, but they kind of stop well short of actually showing, how large these rents are. So take the example of digital advertising. So the paper shows that targeted ad premia are large. And if they weren't, of course, we wouldn't think that appropriation rents could be large. But of course, the targeted ad premia also measure kind of returns to the, the full targeting system that includes things, not just the data, but algorithms, scale, ad market design, network effects. And even if you were to isolate kind of the production value of data access within that, it's still not quite appropriation rents, because to talk about what appropriation rents are, you have to define the counterfactual, right? What was the alternative system? If Facebook didn't just take this data and they had to pay for it, what would be the alternative? And that really gives you what the rents are. I mean, some similar issues with the broadcast spectrum, right? Using an auction in 2017, of course, that reflects, the technological or regulatory demand environment of a much later period than when the innovation happened, a century later. Even if you had contemporaneous productive value, again, what is the counterfactual? I think to actually, causally estimate this, or to kind of isolate that effect, you'd probably need some type of institutional shock that isolate the additional rents from controlling the resource under unresolved claims versus under a specified counterfactual rights regime. This might be too much for this paper. I think to the extent that that's true, if there's other pieces of evidence that you can triangulate with this, it would be helpful. Or maybe you just say, this is an important but challenging question. These kind of calculations suggest that it could be large. And then the final empirical question that I want to touch on, and again, I know explicitly didn't talk about this in the talk, but is the question, is the expansion of the resource frontier important for economic growth? Of course, this is the million-dollar question. It's a really hard question. And so the way that they address it is to do a growth accounting exercise, and that growth accounting exercise is a partial equilibrium exercise that measures the importance of selected frontier industries. And so this is, again, quite different from measuring the importance of those appropriation rents for economic growth, because you're basically saying in these sectors that in these industries that we've coded as having large appropriation rents, are these meaningful for economic growth, since 1970? Now, if they weren't, then you could say, well, appropriation rents aren't important, but these sectors are potentially important. I think the challenges are, first of all, this is the contribution of certain sectors, not of appropriation rents. It's partial equilibrium, and also the estimates are quite sensitive to what sectors you include, which makes sense given what it's measuring, and to the assumed elasticity of substitution. So how would you seriously look at this? This is something I think that's well beyond the current paper, but for the broader agenda, I think it would be really valuable to have industry-level measures of exposure to frontier resources. Now, this is probably impossible for oil in the 19th century or spectrum in the early 20th century, but maybe for more modern resources, this is something that would be more feasible. Once you are able to have industry-level measures of exposure to frontier resources, then you could think about GE effects, tracing them through input-output linkages or other forms of linkages. Separately, you might want to have causal identification. Of course, then you're going to have to probably go to a more microeconomic level. As with the previous question, you need institutional variation in appropriation rents. You need a different set of outcomes, like innovation, entry, value-added, markups, downstream adoption, et cetera. But I think, in short, I think that this is a really promising question. I'm not criticizing the paper for having this kind of back-of-the-envelope explanation, but I think that that there's interesting work that could be done to shed more light on it. And so I'd say kind of my overall comments are I really enjoyed the paper. To the extent that I'm giving these suggestions, it's just because the paper is doing a lot and opening up so many questions that I think there's a big scope to build an entire agenda out of this. Thank you.
So great. For questions, please just come to the mics actually for this session. Easiest.
Do we have to?
Jane?
Okay. Wonderful. Very, very provocative. You know, I'm a one-note guy. I know one example really well. And so I want to take your logic and ask you to extend it to that. So if I think about unlicensed spectrum, seems that has opened up a huge frontier. Unlicensed spectrum, you know, you more commonly know the Wi-Fi or Bluetooth, but it's broader than that. It applies actually quite large, in a large number of examples. And yet, I don't see, if I understand the logic here, I don't see the competition for the rents there. Maybe because it's a shared resource? Is that where the logic breaks down? And then if I think of another example that's too complicated, but it has some of the same characteristics, of course, it's the web, complemented by copyleft, right? The copyleft institution, which is again a shared set of, you know, a set of resources that were shared necessarily. And so, and I do see some of the conflict that you're, but not entirely what you're forecasting. And so thinking through those examples would be interesting. Okay, thanks.
Yeah, very interesting paper, thought-provoking, and I'm just going to, you know, make some comments that are related to Melissa's comments too. The first is, the point is that, you know, property rights are valuable when there is an opportunity cost for the resource. If there's no opportunity cost for the resource, then property rights are really not meaningful. And in fact, if there were no opportunity cost for the resource, the equilibrium price would be zero for that resource. And so, so then once we realize that, you know, that property rights matter only when there is an opportunity cost of a resource, we need to think about that opportunity cost. And we need to think economically, and this goes back to the welfare question that Melissa was saying, we need to think economically of what is that value of that opportunity cost, right? In allocating to alternatives. And there could be, you know, alternative uses for consumption, but it also could be even other directions of innovation. So if there are property rights for the resources, then there is going to be a mechanism in the market to select the right or the best innovators that are going to get the most from, you know, that the use of that resource. So, and so that's sort of my point. So, and then the other thing is that if we have many directions in which innovation could take place, and there are some in which, you know, there's a resource which is unpriced, you know, and which is wrongly priced in the sense that it's not being, you know, priced, that's going to lead to the wrong direction of innovation. So, you know, there might be innovation in that direction, but perhaps those innovative resources could have been used, you know, researchers and so on could have been used in other more economically valuable once we take into account these opportunity costs of the resources into consideration. So sort of, that's sort of my point. And if there is an opportunity cost, and then, you know, you're saying, okay, well, but by not paying that, there's going to be more research and sort of there's going to be more innovation. Is that good for the economy or not? I mean, maybe it's a question of externalities. The opportunity cost, it does not generate externalities, innovation does. Is that the point? And but in some ways we need to be explicit about that. And if that's the case, if there is sort of an externality that is generated, isn't there better ways of treating that externality? Or in subsidies to innovations in that sense, better than, you know, allowing for an unpriced resource which is not taking into account opportunity cost?
So okay. So I think this is actually, to my mind, this is kind of the greatness of the paper, that basically looking at something very simple and making a point in terms of the direction of innovation, that if there's a resource that does not have any use, there's no point in spending the time and effort to define property rights, and you only define property rights when you find a use for it. So I think this is kind of to me, the main insight of the paper. As in all great papers, it's very simple once you think about it. So my question was in terms of the what happens later, and it seems that, you know, if everybody agrees on the value, then you can, you know, avoid deadweight costs of litigation by sort of contracting. So in your paper, as I understand it, the rents go one way, but it doesn't matter. They could bargain, or it goes the other way, but there would not be litigation. Litigation would happen in real life and in models if there's asymmetric information, expectations that are different, or somebody's over-optimistic. And I wonder if there's a way to address these issues. Thank you.
David Otter, MIT. So I agree, brilliant paper. I think this is such a great topic. Let me suggest that sometimes these resources are not unpriced, but they're thought to be inalienable, and technology figures out how to alienate someone of that resource. So for example, when a machine trains on your behavior, you never thought that was something that could be taken from you, right? Or, you know, people talk all the time at MIT about, you know, brain jacking, that pretty soon you'll be able to read brain waves. I didn't know that was something that someone could appropriate for me. So some of the externality, some of the resource is, it doesn't have a price because it's assumed non-tradable, and the technology liberates it from that status, often to the benefit of the innovator at the expense of the previous holder of that right.
Great, awesome paper, Martin. Super insightful, especially on how we think about growth and property rates. One way I think for innovation people, and maybe like theory of the firm people, to frame it though, that might be more compelling, is just start with Grossman-Hart Moore. Like, I already hear people saying words like externality when I don't think there's any externality anywhere in this paper. Like, Grossman-Hart Moore is just, I need ex-ante investments to be made. They're made by the person who appropriates more of the rents. I can't ex-ante incentivize everyone, so someone's going to be unhappy with that allocation of rents, but there is some first best. And you can think of like a new resource as just being something where the first person to develop, in a Cartesian sense, that resource gets full allocation of the rents and then can like reallocate it as they want ex post. And then in Scotchmore Green world, I see why uncertainty is going to cause inefficiencies. I just think that framing will like pull people away from thinking what you're talking about is like exploitation or externalities, when it's really just, I can't make everyone happy with ex-ante property rights allocations. And we know how this works in theory of the firm, and it seems like the same idea is going to apply now to growth and macro factors.
Great, so two comments. One might be a semantic or language thing, but I think this is probably well known to many in the innovation group, but often when we write down models, we think about patents as or other kinds of IP as a good way of protecting and appropriating rents, but in reality, patents and other IP are actually a pretty poor way of appropriating rents outside a few sectors like pharmaceuticals. Most of the time, the way that firms appropriate rents is through lead times, secrecy, keeping hold of key workers. So there's always a lot of ambiguity. There's much more ambiguity, I think, than often people realize in the ability to actually appropriate the benefits from R&D and innovation. So it might be a much more generic thing than the one that you're discussing. The other comment I was thinking of, the example I kept going through in my mind, is how we would think about the 18th century enclosure movement in your kind of model. Because there's an example, the enclosure movement in England in the 18th century. So the classic example there is where you had, land which was, under, common rights of people working on the land, and then it was enclosed, and led to the growth of bigger units, more mechanization, more innovation, more experimentation. That's an example, I think, where you started off with kind of less clear certain rights, and then one to where there was more clear and certain rights. And like David said, that was an example where things were clearly expropriated. And I think the difference is, tell me if this is wrong, in your examples, it's where things were kind of valueless before and then they became valued. But I think if you think most of the areas of that, that was a very conflictual moment, comes when there was already some pre-existing, at least kind of ownership of property rights, and then that got expropriated away.
Let me just say we're running out of time in our session, so those who are standing up, maybe just make very short comments, and no one else come to the mic, or we're going to have to, we're going to call them the bouncers. Chris, I don't know, you were kind of in the intermediate territory, so but really quick.
Okay. Am I first? So I just I thought it would be helpful for the paper to be a little clearer about the frontier resources and the value of property rights over assets that are complementary to those resources, right? So to Shane's example of unlicensed spectrum, or like, why do so many companies invest in solar technologies? They are never going to be able to appropriate, access to the sun. It's because they do have strong property rights over the complementary skills and technologies that they're developing to harness it, which creates innovation incentives. So I think the model and the growth accounting exercise kind of have to be very specific about the idea of a complementary assets for which there are property rights.
Great. Two quick questions. One is it just about property rights or other forms of regulation? Because I can think of like many other types of innovation that sort of enter in a vacuum, in a regulatory vacuum that's not specifically about property rights. So Airbnb listings, clearly that's my house, but sometimes I cannot use it for renting it on Airbnb. Is that a form of property right? I don't know. And the second question is, like, are you trying to say that the speed of innovation would be lower if property rights were well defined? And in that case, what would it mean for property rights to be well defined? Because we do live in a world with incomplete contracts, and so how do we create that completeness?
Just two quick comments. The first one is innovation at the frontier makes me think of sort of the frontier like in Australia when British came to Australia and in this model no property rights exist. Well, no property rights existed in Australia because there's a British court decision that said it was terra nullius. Nobody owned it because nobody in the country actually had a right to anything, but there were people in the country already, millions of them. And so actually the lack of property rights was what was established by a new violent government coming in. Secondly, in Australia, gold prospecting at one stage was prohibited because it was thought that the externalities from gold search, something that was raised before, were so negative as to make gold prospecting undesirable. So there's an example where the government was acutely aware of a trade-off between the externalities and the resource rents.
Great, thanks everyone. Martin, can you take like 30 seconds just to...
30 seconds.
Yeah, you can't do it anyway, so just be
Thank you
brief.
very much to Melissa. She did an amazing job, and there's a reason I didn't talk about welfare, because of all the reasons that she mentioned. I think that's each instance should be thought separately, because all these trade-offs may be different for different types of resources, and the model is way too simple to think about that. And then I can talk with each one of you about your questions individually. Thank you very much.
Okay, we're going to go directly into our next session with Christian Poikart and co-authors.
All right, so thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to the organizers for putting the paper on the program. This is going to be fun for me to present because it's something I've been wanting to work on for a while, and finally was able to put the team together and found the people who know how to do it. So all I have left to do is to actually talk about it. So I wanna start by motivating the project by saying that copyright enforcement really has become a platform infrastructure. If you think about the scale of YouTube, then about half of all the videos that are on YouTube contain music, and of course YouTube is growing at crazy rates. And whenever something contains music, you immediately also want to think about copyright, because not all of the music that is in these 9.5 billion videos can be original, and that creates, of course, a liability issue for a platform that operates at that scale. So what YouTube did is essentially react to this liability by creating a system called Content ID, which essentially compares each and every upload with reference files that rights holders have supplied. And then conditional on finding a match, it gives rights holders actually the option to either monetize, block, or track the viewing data. And the catch, of course, is that the platform decides which rights holders can actually participate in the system. And this motivates our research question, which is essentially, what happens when copyright enforcement is largely privatized at this scale? Whose rights are actually enforced accurately? Why? Is it a question of sort of the technology itself, the algorithm? Is it a question of the reference data, who owns stuff or who claims to own stuff, versus the governance, sort of the rules that the platform sets? And just to give you a little bit more of these big numbers to convince you that this is an economically important setting, Content ID processes about 2.5 billion claims per year. So if you want to, you can think about this as the largest private police force. And then, of course, more than 90% of the enforcement actually results in monetization. If you give people the option to take money, turns out they do take the money. And then there's, a YouTube transparency report that sort of gives you these big numbers of how much YouTube has paid out. There's also empirical research that looks at takedown decisions on these platforms, but given that I just told you that 90% leads in monetization, we're just looking at the very tip of the iceberg, and that's essentially what we want to do in this paper, is to essentially do a large-scale audit and trying to understand what's beneath the surface. So we're going to test Content ID's accuracy by uploading 15,000 videos that contain works that are, some of them are inside of copyright protection, others are outside of copyright protection, and then we're going to first see whether the system technically works accurate in the sense that it identifies the correct work, and it turns out that it can do that in a large number of cases, 93 to 98%. And then the interesting part is really that there's also substantial under and substantial over enforcement. So if you look at the average, less than 55% of the copyrighted recordings are actually claimed. And so when you start to look into who actually owns them and represents them, major label recordings, as well as more popular works where there's more demand for it, maybe also on YouTube, then they get almost full enforcement. When it comes to over-enforcement, we find that 45% of the stuff that's actually outside of copyright still receives a claim, and then it's a little bit more tricky to figure out why this is happening, but at least 25% could be due to fraud. I'll have a couple of slides on that. That's, of course, the most difficult part in this project. And then one of the benefits of working with a law professor is that you actually understand the context. And so we can also do tests of the territorial accuracy, essentially exploit differences in copyright law across jurisdictions and essentially replicate these over and under enforcement results. So really the interpretation that I have from all these numbers is that the algorithm itself appears to work well, but then governance and effective participation really determines the under enforcement, sort of reflecting the legacy institutions that always have played a role in copyright, while also the rights data quality essentially shapes the over enforcement and the territorial accuracy. And of course, these two things go hand in hand because the platform also decides, not only decides on who can participate, but also on how much they want to verify of the data that the participants deliver. So I want to give you a little bit of a background, starting with the related literature. There's people, including people in this room, have worked on private enforcement, platform governance, reuse, all of these interesting questions that we are trying to add something or essentially build upon. And then the other part of background that I can't spare you is a little bit of how copyright works in the context of music. So broadly, you can think about two sets of rights. One is composition rights that are attached to the original composer, but what happens in reality is, of course, that it's assigned to publishers. And then copyrights in general just go on forever. The composition rights expire 70 years after death, and there are some little differences in jurisdictions. And when I say jurisdictions, I mostly focus on US versus EU. And then when you look at the recording / neighboring rights, Also, these are attached to the original performer, very often assigned to record labels. Also here, copyright essentially goes on forever, and there are some subtle differences across jurisdictions. And these two takeaways that you want to take from this slide is, first, copyright goes on forever, which also reflects kind of our research design and what it means if we want to upload things that are for sure outside of copyright. And the second, that there are these differences across jurisdictions that we can exploit. Now, next part in terms of background that I want to talk about is how Content ID actually works. So you can think of this as two layers. The technical layer, that's essentially a fingerprinting algorithm that matches uploaded audio tracks of videos to reference files and then compares or uses the metadata in these reference files to essentially issue a claim. What's quite fascinating about this fingerprinting technology is that it can do the literal recording matching, but it can also match melodies, which seems to be, at least to my mind, a much harder question to do. So that maps this duality in copyright law with the recording rights as well as the composition rights. So it can do both of these things. And then there's the institutional layer. That's about the metadata and the asset database, where the rights holders or the claimants kind of fill all the information, ownership, type of rights, the territories in which it applies, and then blanket policies that they can decide ex ante on. And so with all of these, we can ask two questions. Is the correct work identified? And then also, does the claim reflect legal entitlement? And just for those of you who have not thought about what monetization means in this context, essentially it just means more or less a zero-sum game from YouTube's perspective, so they can either decide to share advertising revenues with rights holders or with the video uploader, and that also gives you already some indication of what the incentives of the platform might be. Last thing in terms of background that I want to talk about is who gets access to Content ID. And if you look at YouTube's website, you'll find a sentence like this that says it's for those copyright owners with the most complex management needs, such as records labels, and then these also need to have the resources to manage Content ID and so on. So there's a direct access channel where you kind of get invited to participate. From public documents, we know that this is roughly 7,000 or so entities. And of these 7,000 entities, there's also intermediary services that anyone, you and me, can actually buy into and then also get access to Content ID. Content ID is only one of the many copyright management tools that YouTube has, but it's the only one that has automated monetization. All the others that are to some extent open to anyone essentially just allows you to remove things that you think are infringing on your property. All right, so let me talk a bit about the research design. So as I mentioned, we are going to do this audit where we create 15,000 or so blank videos. So this is, when I talk about video, it's actually only about the audio. And upload them to YouTube, then record what we get back in terms of data, claims, assets, the claimants, the territories, the policies, anything you can think of. Of course, we do this programmatically. We're part of a research program, had some API credits that YouTube gave to us. And then important detail, of course, is also that you wanna keep in mind is that our design tests enforcement of direct copyright infringement, not even fair use and all the other exceptions that would exist in copyright law. That's more complicated than what we are trying to do. All right, so we need works that are definitely in copyright. That's the easy part. So we essentially take a random sample of anything that's on Spotify, and that's going to allow us to essentially measure the rate of false negatives. And then we need works that are for sure outside of copyright. That's a little bit more difficult. I just told you that copyright goes on forever, so this will be very old music. And for many of these old pieces of music, recording technology has not existed yet, and so we're also going to focus on composition rights, but make sure the stuff that we upload doesn't have any recording rights attached to it. So we went to great lengths to essentially find things that are also outside of copyright when it comes to recordings by using Creative Commons licensed recordings. And then lastly, at the composer level, you'll find all the compositions that are under copyright in the EU, but not in the US, and some of them are under copyright in the EU and in the US. So at the composer level, you can throw in a composer fixed effect. You have this variation as well. All right, and so with this, we can do three things. First, the matching accuracy, so conditional on receiving a claim. Does the technology actually reference the correct work? Then the enforcement accuracy, which is essentially trying to measure the false positive rate and the false negative rate, conditional on uploading something that's inside of copyright. How often do we get a claim? And the same thing for something that's outside of copyright. And then given that we might find false positive rates and false negative rates that are different from zero, we want to understand where are these errors coming from. Can we explain these divergences with red order types, effective participation, metadata, or this territorial granularity? Okay, so that's the plan. Results will be very easy because it turns out this is very descriptive. I don't need any fancy statistics for that. The heavy lifting was already done by figuring out which things to upload and how to upload. First set of results is on the matching accuracy. So conditional on receiving a claim, does it identify the correct work? And the answer is yes, and it does so better in the contemporary sample, which is again a representative sample of anything that's on Spotify, and a little bit less well for this old classical music, but I think it has to do with the fact that for this classical music we're looking at compositions, which seems to be more difficult to figure out a melody rather than one-to-one matching of a particular recording. These numbers also fit relatively well to benchmarks reported in a research paper authored by people that work for Google that essentially give us numbers from testing a fingerprinting algorithm that looks suspiciously like the one they might be using in Content ID. But again, evidence of this high matching accuracy might be conceptually separate from whether the claimant actually controls an enforceable right. And that's what we see in this table here. This was quite striking. We scratched our heads for a long time when we saw these results, because you get substantial amounts of under-enforcement as well as over-enforcement. So things that should be claimed are not claimed, and things that shouldn't be claimed are claimed at the rate of 45% respectively. And also, it's also quite interesting that these numbers tend to line up, and you have 45% on each. So where is this coming from? Just to understand the under-enforcement, I told you that the access to Content ID essentially is limited to record labels, so that's the easy part to do. We have information on who is the record label associated with the work, and then maybe there's also some economic incentives to go to one of these intermediaries with the work that has greater demand, and so you want to have that represented in Content ID. So what we do is use a popularity measure that we get from Spotify as well. And what you see in this table is essentially major labels have a 40 percentage points almost higher enforcement rate. The most popular song in our sample has a 65 percentage points higher enforcement rate. And then here's a picture that sort of helps you understand how this interacts with popularity. So the least popular work here has the biggest wedge between majors and non-majors, and as you move towards the more popular things where there's more demand, you get into the territory of almost full enforcement. The horizontal line here is the matching accuracy, and you see the confidence bands start to overlap. All right, so then understanding the over-enforcement, so what could go wrong in the system, conditional on having access to Content ID. Claimants essentially supply the metadata for the reference files, so there's all kinds of things that could go wrong. They could upload reference material that's not there, so that doesn't have the right license to do so. It could be incorrect information about the owner, the composer, the rights might have expired since. Maybe there's an overbroad catalog. You essentially enter your entire catalog, don't care about the actual rights, and and maybe also don't tick all the boxes for all the countries in which you have rights, or click all of them where you don't have the rights. So we see some of that. We see some errors that are demonstrably incorrect. You know, sometimes you see a wrong composer. We also, you know, this over-enforcement result that I just showed you in my tables, of course, also consistent with a lot of anecdotal evidence that you can find online, where people describe that they've uploaded their own original music and still got a content ID claim, and so on. And then once you look into the actual entities that claim these non-copyrighted compositions, you see, quite surprisingly, established players, labels, and publishers named as the claimants. This could be good faith mistakes, maybe complex rights chains, you know, just the hassle of updating the information on YouTube, but maybe also the fact that there's very little verification actually going on the platform. And one thing that is really striking is that in our sample at least, which is again old classical music, you get one entity that shows up at a staggering high rate. And so if you Google that entity, you just see that a lot of people are really interested in who is that entity. You don't find really well answers. What you find is a Twitter handle that has this profile picture. So it's a little bit unclear who's doing all of these claims. All right, and so last thing, this is just, you know, essentially a robustness check where we, you know, it cannot be all the access limitations, the majors versus non-major labels and so on, because here we're really looking at, you know, just these differences in copyright law on the subsample of these compositions, and you get essentially the same picture of substantial over and under enforcement, which again must be or could be consistent with just a lack of correctness in the metadata. So let me conclude here. We have a little bit of a toy model in the paper. Catherine moved it to the appendix. She says the only reason why this model is in the paper is to make me happy, but I think it can do a little bit more, which is to think a little bit more about welfare effects and explain to you why the system can exist without anyone really complaining about it except people on Reddit, because it seems to be optimal for YouTube. It seems to be, but it's not quite sure whether it's optimal for overall welfare, and I think that sort of gives us a little bit of implications to think about in terms of policy, especially if we are moving into a world where not only copyright is mandated enforcement on platforms, but lots of other things, including content moderation, hate speech. There's a whole wave of regulation in Europe that essentially mandates private enforcement of a lot of things that are much more difficult to actually get a hold of the ground truth than in copyright. And so this might be worthwhile to think about policy implications. That's all I have. Thank you.
All right, yeah, thank you so much. Thanks for the organizers. I was so excited when I saw this paper on the program. I was just hoping they would let me discuss it, and they did. Because I like discussing interesting and good papers, and this one's especially good because it's very creative in a lot of ways. So yeah, I'm just gonna start, right? The paper that no, obviously Christian did a good job, but right, the problem that this paper actually addresses, right? We have this world now with, thanks to digitization, it'll be worse with AI, or better, who knows, right? We'll have millions of songs, many of them on copyright, and they're being used on YouTube, right? So the question is then just how can we compensate these rights holders? And YouTube's been pretty clever here, and they've advertised it a lot, right? This content ID, right? They are automating this process that otherwise is just completely impossible, right? And again, right? The steps here, just to reiterate them, right? Rights holders upload the reference files. That's an important thing. This is actually the rights holders that have to do this work. Then YouTube creates some digital fingerprints, and everything else kind of just happens automatically, right? The new uploads are automatically scanned against that database of references, and then, well, the matches are going to be automatically triggering some chosen policy that the rights holders initially chose in the first place. So that's the world we're in. Now this paper, this sounds wonderful, right? Then basically this question, this paper just asks, well, how well does this work, right? And this is something where I really just want to commend the authors. This is amazing, right? They create, and sorry if I'm off by about 10,000 somewhere here, but right, they this sample of about 5,000 songs or 15,000, question I should have asked earlier. Some are on copyright, some are off copyright. So far, so good. Usually what we do is we'll check if they're in the database and we're good. Now, checking if they're in the database, that's not easy at all, right? Here, we can't look up, this database isn't accessible. So they've become stealthy, they are good at computer science and all of the other stuff, and they upload this 15,000 blank videos with music IP to YouTube, and they just see if it gets flagged. I think this is awesome. First, wow, they did this. That's cool. Second, wow, these results. Now I saw that Christian focused a little more on the negatives. I see the glass half full, but either way it's half something, half empty, half full. So, but this is something big, right? This, just by itself, it just looks like, oh, this doesn't work, right? Now, wow, cool. Now we can be a little more precise, and Christian was more precise, and the paper is much more precise, right? This content ID, it works for the big players. The major labels, they're basically all in content ID, they all got flagged, everything's good, right? Popular artists, mostly as well, even for the indies, for the non-majors. But for smaller artists, it's not so much that. And it turns out this is kind of the, the whole distribution of Spotify's popularity in all of Spotify, and they took a stratified sample that basically matches this distribution. But we see most of these things, well, they're not popular. Right? So somewhere here, with all of that, all of these results, well, they had me at hello, right? Now, okay, all of this actually happened on page 20, so a little more of hello, how are you? But that's about it, right? Now, with all of that, that's what this paper is doing. I want to stand back, because I have a little bit of time, and, just thinking overall about this copyright problem, right? Again, we have millions or billions of copyrightable works and billions or trillions of potential users. It's a lot. Right? And what we'd like to do in general, what we'd like to do in innovation and all of the other settings is, well, we want to facilitate essentially two things. We want people to be able to use stuff, right, for consumer surplus, for follow-on innovation and all of the other stuff. But we also want to compensate the original rights holders or those who created the original work because, well, we want to encourage continued creation as well. So we basically have two options to do this, right? One is an ex-ante system, secure rights in advance, otherwise you're not allowed to use it. Or we can have this ex-post system, which is what YouTube is doing. Everybody just uses whatever stuff they want to use, and then some automated system is going to give them money ex-post. Now, which ones of these should we choose? Well, the ex-ante systems actually seem a little bit like a nightmare, right? We've got problems with potentially fractional ownership, how to coordinate people. Maybe even more important here, sometimes it's hard to locate rights holders. We've got orphan works, HathiTrust, Google Books, lots of things that have been a thing here. First, I just Googled orphan books or something, and then all I learned was about little orphan Annie. Didn't take that picture in, but we had it. So then here we are basically. We're in a world where we can choose between a nightmare that we know doesn't really work, or it's been problematic, and this thing that, this ex-post regime, right? And just by itself, it seems a little more promising, right? The nice thing is we can still use the content even if the rights holders can't be found. So we're not limited by whom we can locate. But we, of course, have this other problem, and this is what this paper is also saying. Well, we have this incomplete compensation. We were only able to compensate about half of the songs or half of the rights holders, right? And of course, then again, this issue with the long-term incentives. So what I want to think about here, right, is this idea, like, how bad is this, right? We are in this world that seems better than the alternative, but what are we going to do with this, right? So basically the main question that I want to focus on for the rest of my discussion is, well, is this non-participation? That's kind of how I think of this. Most of this seems to be something where these rights holders of these low popularity songs just, they're not registered. They're not in this database. That's mostly how I read this. Is that actually a problem, right? And so I want to kind of focus on 3 specific questions here. First, what is the overall value of the works that are not included? Are these actually consequential works? Secondly, how would the benefits of inclusion or of signing up for Content ID, do they actually exceed the cost? Or are we in a world where, it's just not efficient to do so? And then lastly, right, are these distributors potentially just charging unreasonably high prices, and we have issues that are really kind of, dropping the little guys from the market? So I want to just, these are the 3 things that I want to think about first, right? We know many songs are not included. How much value is actually lost? So Kristen showed this picture. I think it's great. It really tells the whole story. Low value IP, less likely to be included. Majors pretty much sign up. And then we have lots of low value IP in the sample, right? So what is this low value IP? What's this long tail? Well, here's one example of a long tail product. I think I earned $2.10. Thank you, Jeff Furman, for 70 cents of those, except that, I didn't pass the payment threshold, right? How bad is this, right? Now, okay, be a little more realistic, or go back to the paper. Sorry for this self-indulgence here. Don't buy the book. Okay. So, but the question then is, right, who exactly actually isn't signing up here, right? So, is it Olivia Rodrigo or Radiohead? We probably heard of them, right? No, they sign up, right? They have popularity scores in the 80s and 90s. Many of us might remember Marcy Playground or the Partridge Family. I'm also trying to seem cool by choosing songs. Right, these are also mostly signing up, right? Now then we have to we have to dig even deeper, right? Anybody remember Marshall Crenshaw? One person, okay. Anybody know of Heavenly? Yeah, okay, all right. Well, yeah, they probably also signed up. Okay, so then we have to dig really deep. We basically have to dig into the world of economists also doing music, they are probably the ones that are not signing up, right? So that's a bit of a question here, right? So the question that I want to ask is, what share of the value is actually missed, right? One thing that one could do potentially is sum up the artist monthly listeners in each of these buckets of signing up or not. We can be a little more precise than fitting a linear line through it or something, but this could be an approach, right? Okay, so that's one thing. What's the value? I wish I could give you an answer, but they have cool data, they can probably answer this better, right? Second question here, why are the little guys missing out, right? Is this just a story of benefits versus costs? Like how much money can they make versus how much does it cost? Well, actually, the authors are putting up a couple of things here in this, in the paper and also in the presentation, right? YouTube does seem to have potentially high barriers to signing up. We have potentially low benefits to signing up. It's a bit of a question if that's actually true. There's also a possibility that maybe not everybody knows that we can get money from YouTube if we upload stuff, right? That's another potential market failure here. So thinking about these high barriers, this is one table that just shows the claimants, and what we see is that the top 7 make up 60% of the claims that we see, but that also means that the bottom 290 make up 40% of the claims, so it's a little bit of a question of how much, how much there actually is in terms of like what these barriers are. And actually, but I'm not going to ask too much about this because, as Chris also showed, right, like they need to have a substantial body of original material and so on. So I think we're pretty much in a world here where, okay, there are barriers. So then we go, well, they can get a distributor, right? So pick CD Baby. You can release a single for $9.99 that you have to pay once, and then you share the revenue, 30 cents per dollar you get from Content ID. So with a little bit of math that I could still do, right? I'd break even basically if my song makes $14.27 through Content ID, and then, you know, off that I would get the 70%, which are $9.99. So what I need is, I basically need X views per year. ChatGPT told me X is about 16,000. Take that for what it is. You know, so then the question is basically how many songs with more than these X views don't actually sign up or don't participate in this market, right? And if that's a lot, if there's a lot of songs that actually would pass this threshold, then there seems to be market failure. If basically all of the songs that, that don't sign up wouldn't pass this threshold, then it just seems like an efficient thing that they're not signing up, right? Okay, now we can think about this slightly differently as well. Right? Suppose that the rights holders are not actually making a mistake. Well, then we have a really nice situation to understand copyright even more deeply. Right? We see that rights holders, you know, we see what rights holders could gain by signing up. We see the costs. We can think of the signing up or this, you know, this uploading something here as like similar to a patent renewal that then in turn could tell us something about what the value of a copyright is. You know, we know some work on patents on that as well, right? So those are some other things that we can think about here. Then, right, so basically based on all of this, yeah, maybe there's something about costs versus benefits. We'll have to do the math to learn what it actually is. Then, the third question that I wanted to think about, right, is there some kind of, can we get some relief for the little guys? It's not clear that it's, you know, even if it's efficient, these little guys are still missing out, right? They're still not able to participate in this, right? So there's a bit of a question. Maybe the prices are just too high, right? So what can we do for these little guys? And so here, you know, we could think about something that also came up, right? We could compel YouTube to just open Content ID for everybody, right? Just we don't need these distributors. Just have like, anybody who wants to can access Content ID. But then what we'd have is this Latin author, I did not put the picture up, you know, they might just claim everything or the equivalent of Latin author, right? I mean, that's basically what we have here. Now, with that then, right, what can be done given that the distributors exist? We kind of have to live with that, right? Because otherwise, too much Latin author. So, you know, might the distribution price actually, or the distributor's price be too high? Well, actually, you know, we have, I just put in N because it was hard to figure out, but it seems like somewhere, you know, there's like 95 distributors that YouTube works with, or if I look at Content ID management, they show 134. So this almost seems like competition. So with competition, why isn't the price driven to zero, right? Is it high fixed costs? Now here's a wish list that's pretty ambitious, I think. One could estimate these, but we'd need information on the total references per distributor and so on. We could, because you have a stratified sample, maybe scale things up and get to that number. It could also be conclusion. One could kind of look into what, you know, what might be going on in terms of these costs. Is this just something where we should have a natural monopoly or something like that? But you know, even this, it's not entirely clear. It'd be nice to know if this is something that has to do with collusion or maybe just high fixed costs in the natural market. So, circling back, what we have is, well, Content ID is not perfect by any means, right? The glass is half full, but it's also half empty. So, it's not clear, but it's not quite clear yet how bad this imperfection actually is, right? Like, what's the value that's lost? What is it market failure? Is it fixed cost? What is it? And other options don't really seem feasible. So I just want to leave this with the words of Winston Churchill or something like that. Ex post compensation via Content ID is the worst form of compensation except for all the others. So, but really interesting paper.
Just a quick clarification question or maybe thought. Is the fact that I assume no one listens to your videos, is that a key contributing factor to maybe some of this lack of enforcement action? Can they condition the enforcement on the amount of listens to the video? Yeah.
Super interesting. I was wondering, so there's one story which is the cost versus benefit story that Imke was mentioning, but then even if it was completely costless to apply for these things, it might be the case that the little guys might find it optimal to just not enforce these things because they want some distribution early on. So I wonder if you can use some information about who is not enforcing, maybe content creators early on in their career, and it's optimal for them not to do so. Thanks.
I would love for you to have a little more about the rights organizations and composers and the composer piece. So I think my understanding of what you did was you took stuff from Spotify, and I'm just curious, like, where possibly this accuracy chain breaks. So, the Zootons composed Valerie, which we all associate with Amy Winehouse. I'm pretty sure if you use the Amy Winehouse version, the Zootons get paid. But I don't know, like every band in the world has covered Valerie, and so I think the role of the composers and the composers getting paid, there's a little discussion of it at the beginning, and then we kind of quickly shift to the sound recording here, and some clarity around that I think would be helpful.
Super interesting paper. So I'm thinking from kind of two different angles. So one is the rights holders or the composers, so to speak, and I think there's a focus on monetization as this is what we are doing this for, but in music as in arts and in science, very often it's not about the money, right? And I wonder whether this differential enforcement is partly a function of costs, benefits, but also of different incentives. Going back to an earlier comment, some people just love seeing their music diffused, and there might be in kind of a short-term, long-term thing. If my music gets famous because it's free, then later on I can run concerts and I get paid later on. So it reminds me also of the open source discussion, where the question has always been, why do people make their code open source, right? And then the second question, building on this to some extent, what I see here is a model with different prices for different types of music. That's not your paper, right? But do the people who are actually doing the videos choose different composers because they know certain things get enforced or not? In some sense, your 45% non-enforcement numbers, is that market knowledge? And if not, it would be a nice experiment to see, once you diffuse that number to people, do you see a convergence towards lower status musicians because we know they're not enforcing their rights, which may be good for everyone in the end.
So a great paper, and something we're all thinking about, and you document it very nicely with a nice experiment. And I was just wondering, I have a clarification question regarding the issue of fair use. And I was just wondering if the algorithm is designed to detect fair use, or is it that some of the songs that are flagged would basically be later defended as fair use? For example, the weird guy that you showed at the end. So which one it is, and that affects how we view and frame the results. Thank you.
Very nice. So I had the sense that the paper implicitly assumes that policing is free for Google, and that may not be the case because you're comparing against like all copyrightable material in history. So if Google is instead strategic, then you might imagine that the longer tail stuff doesn't get checked as often, and as Andre pointed out, that you may wish to wait for some threshold of views before you check, and even just for your account, as you put more of this copyrightable material, maybe the censors become more likely. Thanks.
So both mistakes are actually quite interesting. So the first one is the one that we seem to be focusing on the most, which is sort of artists that have a claim not actually making the claim. And you should do all the things that Imke has suggested. I wonder whether you can even survey these people. Like, you have their handles on Spotify or something. Is there a way for you to understand why they are not claiming their rights? And then the other mistake is also even interesting and baffling. Like, this Latin author, how much money is he making, or she making, out of claiming property rights over work of art that's not theirs? And is there something that we should do about it? Clearly, Google doesn't have the incentives to do anything about it, so it's little money, but...
Okay, thank you. Yeah, Christian, you want to respond?
Yeah, I just want to thank Imke for the great discussion, as expected. This was extremely helpful. Also, thanks for the comments. There's some really interesting suggestions that we haven't thought about, and I'm looking forward to incorporating all of this in the next version of the paper, and I don't have to fight over the model with Catherine, because we have more stuff to put in there. Thanks so much.
Okay, we now have a break, which you may not see in your program, depending on which version you're looking at. We have a break until 3:30 when we reconvene for our final session.
by a CNC machine that is not.
All right, let's get started for our final paper. Take it away.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm Sagar Bhaviskar. I'll be presenting my work, Elite AI Talent, Innovation, and Firm Productivity in the Age of AI. First of all, thanks to the organizers for including our paper in the program. We really appreciate it. This is a joint work with Lee Brandstater, Cameron Drayton, Brian Fuji, Sunny Tambe, Edward Hovey, and Lu Jebu. I think we have Lee and Sunny in the audience, and also Lu Jie. Thank you guys for showing up. All right. Over the past few years, we have seen something quite interesting, quite remarkable happening. Top AI researchers are receiving offers once reserved were only for CEOs and CXOs of the firms. Multi-million-dollar signing bonuses, equity packages, and even bidding wars between firms like Google, Meta, OpenAI, Anthropic, etc. So we are looking at this AI era where the scarcest resource is not really data or compute. It's actually the human capital at the frontier of this AI human knowledge. So we are trying to essentially understand and address the impact of these frontier talent on firms' output. So we're building on existing literature on the role of star scientists and their graduate students in the movement of knowledge from academia to industry. We are also extending the literature between AI investment, AI innovation, and productivity growth. So the research question, as I mentioned, that we are trying to address is what difference do these elite AI graduates make in firm productivity and AI patenting? So the natural question is, how do we actually define these AI graduates, elite AI graduates to be specific? So we are taking a genealogical approach. So these are PhD students and postdoctoral researchers that are trained by the world's leading AI scientists. So these world-leading scientists are essentially publishing at the frontier of AI research. When I use the word elite, we mean the elite by mentorship, not just a co-authorship or affiliation, but it has to be the frontier AI knowledge transmitted through the direct academic apprenticeship. So they have to have spent a certain amount of time with the advisor, either as a PhD student or a postdoc. And then once these frontier AI talent are employed by firms, they serve as key conduit, transferring these frontier AI methods into commercial and organizational settings, so bringing that knowledge to industry. What might these elite graduates do for these companies that hire them? So drawing upon the prior literature, like I showed before, we anticipate 3 distinct but complementary channels. So first one is knowledge transfer. So they bring frontier tacit and embodied AI knowledge from elite academic environments to these firms. Second, capability augmentation. So they do have this network of other elite graduates that they can bring into the firm, or in fact augment the capabilities of existing talent, which may not be the frontier AI talent. It could be software developer, data scientist, but they can augment their capabilities and overall firm's capability being augmented. And third, which is network spillover. So we have elite researchers and their innovation networks. Again, the frontier scientists who have this embodied network that they have captured, that's being acquired by this firm by acquiring this particular talent or a group of talent. So together, these 3 channels, we believe that contribute to the firm's innovation and productivity, so essentially firm's performance gains. How do we identify these elite AI graduates? So we use publication and conference presentations to find the world's topmost AI researchers. So we start with Elsevier Scopus from 1960 to 2024. One thing I'd like to highlight that we are not only studying the generative AI era in the last few years, we are going back So the LCR publication starts from 1960, but the commercialization starts from 1990 onwards. So our patenting data and the talent data cuts off from 1990 to 2024. So around 3.5 decades. So we have 10 subdomains of AI: machine learning, NLP, computer vision, agentic AI, human-computer interaction, knowledge representation, etc. We look at all top venues of each of these 10 subdomains of AI. So if it's machine learning, we look at ICML, NeurIPS, AAAI, ICLR, and we do this exercise for every single subdomain of AI. These are around 1,200-ish top venues across these 10 subdomains. Then what we refer to these world-class, world-renowned computer scientists as immortals, meaning their work have been quite prominent in the field, that it would never die. So we calculate H index of every single author who have ever submitted work at these top conferences. We take top 0.2 percentile as the cutoff for these leading immortal AI scientists in each of these subdomains. So we've identified around 2,000 these world-leading scientists and around 500,000 research papers associated with these scientists. We then identify these elite AI talent using these immortals, academic websites, personal websites, CVs. Most of the work was manual as we started a few years ago when the language models were yet to be at the stage where they are today. We also use ProQuest dissertation database, so we can find any missing graduates that we might have missed through our search that show up as their advisees on for these elite scientists. So we have so far identified 32,000 plus academic children of these immortals. Around 22,000 of them are US based. And then we look at their career trajectories. So all of these, speaking of US specific 22,000 academic children of these immortals, we look at their career trajectories. So we use LinkedIn data, which comes from Revelio Lab, to find and match these academic children. So we have this employee firm panel data set that we have created, employer-employee firm panel data set that's created. Then we match those firms with CompuStat data, which is essentially the financial and publicly traded companies, only limited to publicly traded companies. We map these employers with those identifiers. We also use, as a proxy to AI innovation, we are using patents. So we use the USPTO patents corpus from 1990 to 2024. We have around 7.2 million patents after cleanup. We are introducing a new framework called Palify. So this is, in simple words, to classify patents into AI or not. It's not just a binary classifier. We have different degrees of AI-ness, whether it's applied, core, whether it's, again, building on foundational models, or it's applying an existing method to a particular domain as such. In the interest of time, I won't go in details of the Palify framework. That's more like a computer sciencey work. We're using a bunch of supervised machine learning models and large language models to create a fusioned model and classify these patterns into AI or not. And this essentially allows us to connect elite AI graduates to firm outcomes. So before we dive into firm level results, I think it's helpful to look at where these individuals emerge from and where do they go. So as you can see, we have Carnegie Mellon, MIT, Stanford, UC Berkeley, usual suspects, proud to be from Carnegie Mellon. As we are topping the chart, it seems like. So, and the orange and blue color that you're looking at is essentially the split between academia and industry. So it's quite interesting to observe that unlike the rest of the graduates, this is almost like a 50-50, 60-40 split between academia and industry, where for other graduates, it used to be 70-30 or 80-20 as compared to industry, as compared to academia. What firms do they go to? Usual suspects, Alphabet being the top of the firm, top of the list. We have Microsoft, Amazon, Meta, US government, Apple, and some other firms. One thing I would like to highlight here is this is CompuStat database. So these are only publicly traded firms. So Anthropics of the world or OpenAIs of the world are not yet in this data set, but we are extending our analysis to incorporate US Census Bureau data, so it's much richer, nuanced at firm level measures that we can have. So we are extending our efforts beyond the computer firms as well. But the results that I'm going to share with you today are only restricted to computer firms. Policymakers are quite concerned about the role of big tech firms, as some of the skeptics believe that this frontier talent is being concentrated in the hands of only these big tech Magnificent Seven firms, and that may have restrictive burden on broad-based economic gains. If you look at this graph, it seems feasible that worry, that concern might be true, as you're seeing that there is an exponential growth in terms of acquiring these frontier AI talent by these big tech firms, especially in early 2000s, and after 2010, it shoots up quite high. But if we zoom out, it's still almost about 20% of the overall population of these frontier AI talent. The 80% of it is still going in diverse firms and diverse industries, so to speak. So the policymakers shouldn't be that concerned in terms of the frontier talent only being concentrated at these big tech firms. Well, what I mean by the big tech firms or Magnificent Seven, these are Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, Meta, Microsoft, NVIDIA, and Tesla. So these are the firms that constitutes big tech. Whose science does these frontier AI folks most intensely cite, especially in the patents? So on the right side, we are looking at the top institutions in terms of number of AI paper citations, scientific literature being cited by AI patents. Again, seems like Carnegie Mellon is topping by quite a margin. Then we have Microsoft, Stanford, IBM, MIT, Google, etc. And we also see an exponential growth, especially post 2015, 2017, which is when the Transformer paper came out, 2017, 2018, and it shoots up quite high. To isolate the contribution of elite AI graduates, we need to account for firms' broader AI workforce. So we therefore construct a systematic measure of general AI talent using employees' position and skill level with progressively broader thresholds capturing different degrees of AI intensity. So as you can see in the pyramid, the top of the pyramid are elite AI graduates, but from second tier onwards, you have position level 5 or skill level 5 employees. So what I mean by position 5 and skill level 5, these are, again, very top-notch AI computer scientists. They may not have the elite lineage, so to speak. They may not have those advisors, but they are at the forefront of the technology. And as we go towards the bottom of the pyramid, it's more lenient, it's lower in AI intensity. So it could be any AI position. You could be an AI ethicist. You could be a product manager, AI product manager, program manager who's working at these firms. So we'll get into the empirics and the results that we find so far. So we adopt the empirical approach first introduced by Zvi Krilikis back in 80s and also in 90s. So these elite AI graduates do increase firms' productivity in manufacturing and information services, as we can see. So it's about 0.2. We ran a different specification, whether you're structuring it across only positions or different levels of AI skills for general AI talent, the results still hold true. So it's quite interesting to one more time notice that these are CompuStat firms, publicly traded firms. So these magnitudes are quite sizable in terms of if you put a dollar amount on those. On the manufacturing side, we do see relatively, as compared to manufacturing, on the information side, we do see relatively higher numbers, which is expected of these frontier AI talent being more productive and improving the labor productivity for the information technology services industry as compared to manufacturing. But relative impact of general AI talent appears to be weaker in information services. So we have this frontier talent who are essentially driving the force of improving productivity. We ran different versions of it, total factor productivity, labor productivity, the results do hold true. But the general AI talent effect is relatively weaker. Moving on to the innovation side, AI patents, as I mentioned, we use patents for as a proxy to innovation. So elite AI graduates do have a much stronger measured impact on AI-related patenting than on productivity. You can see it's almost 10-folds down of the productivity, so almost the range of 40 to 45%, which is quite sizable. Even if you control for general AI talent, the results still hold true, and it's almost 3 to 4 times the effect of general AI talent. We do also run an event study regression. So this is essentially, we're looking at firms that transition into AI patenting and the firms that do not. So we use propensity score matching to find counterfactual firms. So there are firms in the same industry, similar R&D expenses, similar employee sizes, etc. We control for many of those things. And then we have the control firms which do not go into AI patenting, whereas the treatment firms go into the AI patenting. And we do see that on the pre-trained side, there is no, it's not different than zero. So we do not have sort of, our parallel trend assumption do hold true. It does not violate that. After second-ish year onward though, so 2.5 years onward, we do see significant boost in terms of the productivity yield. So it's by year 5, we reach almost about 30%. So again, it's quite non-trivial measure. In the interest of time, I'll quickly mention the takeaways and then I'll open the floor for Ajay. So elite AI talent rests through these academic lineages, help translate this frontier AI knowledge into productivity within these hiring firms. As the firm's stock of these elite AI talent grows, as that becomes much deeper, they do experience improvement in their productivity and innovation outcomes. The flow of talent is quite diverse. I didn't show that slide. If you have questions, I can put that up. It's quite diverse. They're not just concentrated into some set of firms. They're going, and not just into IT as well. They're going into finance. They're going into educational edtech firms and many more industries, so to speak. The event study that I just showed indicate that the AI patenting does precede and predicts the subsequent productivity growth of these firms. So understanding who moves to where is the key to explaining how this AI would shape firms' performance at the broader economy. Thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thanks very much. Thanks to the organizers. This is an interesting paper, a fascinating paper, and it's got an incredible amount of data under the hood. You got a little bit of a sense of that from what you just saw, but I'll explain as we go through. The infrastructure in order to do this paper is actually quite remarkable. I've seen 4 versions of this paper in the last I guess 5 or 6 weeks. To me, this paper feels like there's something fascinating struggling to get out of this paper. And so, the two areas where I think this paper can have a very substantive contribution are in actually understanding the knowledge production function. Okay, so in other words, they are putting a very unique microscope up to star scientists. And what is the role of star scientists in the production of knowledge? Okay, and then the second is in diffusion, so diffusion into companies. This whole paper is predicated on the movement of what they call elite grad students. So these are the grad students that study under stars. So everything as I'm going through, just keep in your mind that that's the treatment. So in a perfect world, what would happen is that these star grad students would be randomly assigned to companies, and then magical things would start to happen as a result of their arrival. Okay, that would be sort of the perfect experiment. So the results they find, first of all, they're going to show that firms that hire these stars subsequently show higher labor productivity, in particular 2 areas that he showed, like manufacturing. That the ones that hire more of these experts generate more patents of these AI patent, special kind of patents, and that when they and there's a very careful word here of transitioning into patenting. I'm going to get to this later, which is when they have their first patent, remarkable things happen 3 years later. And then firms that hire these experts are more likely to produce patents that build on the scientific knowledge from the lab. Okay, so those are the key findings. You heard about the data, the productivity data, both TFP and labor come from the CompuStat data. The patents he went through, I won't go through. He described that there's a multi-step classifier process for classifying all the patents in order to characterize patents as AI patents or not AI. And within AI, there's a variety of different categories of being AI patents. And then, of course, the main workhorse of this paper are these students. So first they start with identifying who's a star based on the H-index, and so their publications, and then who studied with those stars. And that's what they call the children of the immortals. I feel like that's a movie title. And then in all these different subfields of AI. Okay, so what I want to do is highlight what I think are sort of the 3 big highlights of this paper as it's emerging into being. Okay, thing number 1 is, we call this AI, but this field has changed a lot over time. And so even if we just think of the recent history of AI, and if we put a dividing line between generative AI, pre-discriminative AI and then generative AI, that now there's all these third-party tools that firms use in AI. So AI is for customer service, AI is for supply chain management, AI for quality assurance. It's not obvious you need a superstar scientist to help you deploy those tools to enhance productivity. Before generative AI, all the companies that were using were, they had to roll their own. And so they were really building their own AI tools, and it seems much more plausible that they would need scientists in those earlier periods. Yet, when you sort of first go through the paper, it looks like, wait a minute, this is going to be a paper largely about generative AI in terms of like these, what they're calling these like big papers are all quite recent. Despite the fact of, the history of this field and sort of significant milestones spanning a long period. But that's not this paper. So in other words, if your eye gets drawn to this table as mine did, it's a bit deceiving because their data is has a much longer time span. So they are able to actually cover a long period, basically since the 90s. They do a lot of the pre-work leading into the 90s, but with the main regression starts in the 90s. And so I'm going to encourage, and I asked Lee before, and I said, wait a minute, I'm worried that there's a few examples at the end of your data set that are dragging around the regression line and delivering your product, your labor productivity results. And so he said, let me see what happens if we cut it off before the generative AI period. How about 2015? I said that would be great, and they did, and I appreciate they did that, and the results hold. So this is not, the punchline is not a function of just generative AI. In fact, it might not be generative AI at all. We'll see. And so my recommendation for them here is just, I think they can exploit the differences in the nature of AI to give us insight into what elite scientists are doing. And in other words, it would be more surprising to me if they're that important at the foundation model companies, like the regular publicly traded companies that are not AI companies, if they're getting a lift from the scientists in the post Gen AI period. because it's not clear that, in other words, then they're bringing something different relative to the neural net period. Okay, that's really just a preamble to the second point, which is we've thought a lot about stars and what they do in the production of knowledge. And arguably, our understanding is still reasonably, coarse. So when I read this paper, I thought, what am I learning from this paper that I didn't already know, from the work in the 90s, where they showed in biotech that, these biotech companies were disproportionately locating where the star scientists were, and that there was something about star scientists, that they had knowledge that did not diffuse as we might imagine, in terms of the need for the particular depth of scientific knowledge that stars would have needed for commercialization. And the punchline of that Zucker-Darby paper was that geography matters not because of, because of labor markets, not geographic spillovers. And so then I thought, all right, shouldn't we expect in this paper to see that effect substantively reduced, maybe even eliminated? In other words, that work in recombinant DNA was in the 70s. Like, there was no internet, there was no archive, there was no Google Scholar. So now with all those things, the star effect should be significantly diminished if the issue was just the cost of transferring knowledge. But it's not. It seems like their effect seems quite strong. So then the other STAR paper that I wanted to link to here was Pierre and co-authors on their Science Proceeding One Funeral at a Time. And the punchline of Pierre's paper is that these stars are gatekeepers, and that when a star, the key identification in his paper was an unexpected death of a star dies, and all of a sudden there's a flourishing in the field. So in other words, stars are gatekeepers. And so that made me think, wait a minute, they have an opportunity to do something that we've never, as far as I can tell, we've never been able to do to better understand the microfoundations of stars in the knowledge production function. And that is because of one feature of AI that, to my knowledge, is the only field in the sciences that has the following feature, which is, actually, first let me just say the role of stars can be many things. And like, if you go across the star literature, I've written some papers, but in particular, if like the Zucker paper and the Pierre's paper and others have listed all kinds of reasons why stars might matter. But there's one thing on this list that's different than all the others. And if it were the case that it's that one thing, then I think it would very much change the way we think of roles in the production of science, which is all these things are treatments from being in a STARS lab, except the bottom. The bottom is selection. And so in other words, imagine it was the case that the only thing of why these students of STARS matter is because they were better students. That it's not a treatment of being with the stars. And the thing about AI that's unique, different than any other discipline, is it's the only one that's based on benchmarks. So every other field, the way we progress in the field is we compete and we rely on the taste of editors, which was, largely my interpretation of Pierre's paper, was that editors are the gatekeepers and they have taste, and that when there's a replacement, that there's now an opportunity for different tastes. But that's not true with benchmarks. With benchmarks, it doesn't matter if you're in elite school or what people's tastes are, it's whoever performs best against the benchmark wins. So in other words, there's a way to signal quality that is independent of whether you're at a fancy lab. So my request of the authors, it doesn't have to be this paper, but they have all the machinery that they could test this. which is they could do the same thing they did with finding the STAR students and now pulling the names of all the people who win on benchmarks. And those benchmarks are now signaled, those benchmark winners are now signaled as stars. But they are not stars because they are associated with a fancy professor. They're stars because they delivered a winning model. And then we can separate selection from treatment. So finally, the last highlight of this paper is, it's very ambitious, is trying to make the link from science to innovation and productivity in one sweep. I like the fact they're very honest. They show some results in like TFP productivity, but then show that the results are very brittle. If they change how they measure the general AI talent stock, the results go away. Same thing in labor. The labor ones are a little more robust when he showed the subfields, but they're very upfront about how brittle these results are. These are more robust. So they basically do, the first half of the paper is going directly from the scientists to productivity. The second half of the paper is they go from scientists to patents, and then patents to productivity. And that second route is the first half is much more robust, which is not surprising. That the ones who hire scientists generate more, like these stars, generate more patents. But then they have this. And at first I was very excited. I thought, like, this is exactly what you want a sort of a diff and diff to look like. But what's bizarre is it's triggered by a single patent. So in other words, they compare, their event study is sort of similar, coarsely similar firms where one has a single patent and one doesn't. So in other words, as soon as you get one patent, you're treated. And then they compare these two and they get this result. So, this is fragile and a little bizarre, frankly, that they were able to get that from a single patent. But they're cautious in their results. What I want to close with is the underlying assumption of random assignment. Like, think about this labor market. This is as far away as you can get from a random assignment labor market. And so, Joshua, Avi, and I did this, I think it was the first in the world conference of AI stars and economics. And we did it in Toronto trying to convince Canadian business people they should get into AI, and it was like with very little success. And so the treatment here just feels off. And so what I want to encourage them to do is to think about which are the companies that are even in the risk set of recruiting these scientists. In other words, they have to have the complements. They have to have, compute and data and all the goodies that these stars want. So which are at risk of recruiting? And then, subject to that, which are the ones that actually win and successfully recruit? So in my view, the bigger contribution of this paper would be predicting which companies successfully recruit a star, rather than, at this stage, trying to make the leap from science to productivity with the data that they currently have. Okay, I'll wrap it up there.
Really interesting paper, and my thoughts are very much in the spirit of what Ajay just said, that this, there's a story from talent to productivity. There's also a story from productivity to talent. And there's a group of firms that you don't have in this sample, and maybe I guess it's a different paper, but that's where I think you could maybe help identify this a bit better, which is the startups. Famously the Transformer paper, 8 out of the 8 authors went off to start startups. And so that, but they're ones that may not already have, well, I guess some of them do, but they might have the same level of assets that the big established firms have. So there's a little bit more of an argument that the talent is creating the productivity rather than the productivity attracting the talent. So probably something you have to do in a future paper, but there are, of course, these data sets of stars going to startups as well. A lot of them from Stanford, by the way.
Terrific work. First, maybe clarifying question.
We already have AI classification of patents from USPTO. You know, why your classification is better, maybe opportunity for you to highlight how much better yours is. Second, maybe a suggestion and concern at the same time. In our work on role of federal funding of university researchers and the outputs and where students go, we actually found that when you can observe who's funding, federally funded versus privately funded, and what we found is that practically always when there is a firm funding research, students from that private funding go and work for that firm, which kind of exacerbates some maybe endogeneity concerns there. And you can look at that by looking at 2 metrics data. Since you guys are already working with census data, you should talk to Bitsy, my co-authors Bitsy and Joe, who are here on that. And last, I was thinking like identification, right? Like it's a valid concern here. Can you use the unexpected death of a star professor somehow as a shock to kind of networks from the research lab to the firms that maybe used to hire from there?
Yeah, no, awesome paper. One thing that Jay mentioned that I wanted to pick up on is the like what are these stars doing? And so mining basically like the sentences, the text in their publications. And so that would also get at the selection story, because if you see, you know, different authors coming up with like similar novelty of content, then it would kind of go in favor more of selection. But then you can also get at the question of like, are there complementary things that people are bringing? They're bringing their networks, they're bringing their like other really talented friends and so on. So, you know, lot of exciting things to do, but really cool.
There is a perception, and I don't know if it's true, but that more recently, when the elites and in this field go to a firm, they don't stay there very long. And so I was listening to you a lot and trying to reconcile that notion of rapid turnover and moving across firms with the way you've constructed the question. And so I thought, well, how could you reconcile them? One reconciliation of that would be, again, perception. I don't know if it's true, but you could know, which is that the extra turnover that we're observing is because the elites are moving into locations where you have thick labor market demand and supply meeting each other. And so they are not really choosing firms, they're choosing locations, and they're anticipating rapid turnover. And you have the data to verify or falsify that by showing concentration of the locations to which they go, since they're all coming from places, and how it's changed over time.
So just like an obvious point you must have thought of, which is, you know, with the type of data you're using, it's very hard to control the other forms of skills and human capital. So it might be that when you're looking at elite scientists now, so you're just picking up general increases of human capital. So you might want to think about, you know, like the Revelio Labs data would give you broader things about skills, or maybe if we're using administrative data or a bit of wage data. But I think other, you know, on top of the usual endogeneity, there's a very prosaic concern that's correlated with just, you know, higher human capital.
I think this is really great. I understand why you're rather laudatory of the approach of hiring stars into a firm. What I'd be curious about is the conditions under which it's not necessarily a good thing. And that there is a fair amount of HR literature which points out that when you bring in high performers, especially in lower performing locations, it can have a negative effect on the output of other labor. And I think it would be interesting to explore the conditions under which this is not necessarily a great idea. I think that might bring some roundness to the interpretations of the findings.
I think it's very much follow up on Ajay's point about endogenous matching between talent and firms, and the previous comment as well. Thinking about how to construct the risk set of potential added value of elite scientist to a particular firm, and there's so much machinery now about like exposure to automation or et cetera that can help you think through the added value, but a key factor is this sort of fairness idea within the large firm especially. And anecdotally, like firms cannot, even though they know there's huge added value, but they cannot dole out so much money to hire like an elite scientist. And I wonder how much you can use Glassdoor wage distribution data or even like public firm, like top management disclosed wage data to have a measure for tolerance for wage inequality of a firm to help you get that aspect of the matching function.
Yeah, again, really interesting paper. So thinking about the timing aspect of the hiring. So are these people being hired directly, these elite AI grads being hired directly out of their PhD programs? Are they being hired before they graduate? Are they doing something else in between, for example, going to a startup and then coming in? So just kind of thinking a little bit what's happening from their training through the moment when you actually see them hired at the firms.
Very interesting work. A quick question about whether this is diffusion. Could you see if some of the patents that the elite scientists are filing are actually written jointly or filed jointly with the immortals? And then a question about sort of some of the mechanisms. Do elite talent, AI talent, have effects on patents that are non-AI related as well? And in a slightly different vein, do you see that this elite AI talent has a positive effect on either patenting or productivity in firms that we don't necessarily would associate with AI technology? Thanks.
You want to take maybe a few questions? 2 minutes? Okay. So, do you want to go first? Choose questions you like the best.
Yeah, sure. So first of all, Ajay, thank you very much for that very helpful, insightful, and gracious discussion. A lot of comments related to issues of identification. In the text, we try and be very, clear and modest about the limits of where we are at the moment. There are ways that we can improve on that. Where's Eric? There you are. Yeah, startups. Yeah, so we are working with folks at Census, right? We absolutely agree with you, right, that looking at the CompuStat firms is probably not necessarily where we're going to see really big effects, and whatever effects we find are confounded with lots of different things. Looking at smaller firms, startups, is probably where a lot of the action is, and that's definitely where we're going, right? As folks probably know, right? There's been a little bit of turbulence in the Department of Commerce, but we're pretty confident that we can work with those data. Yeah, Tanya, you mentioned why our patents are better than the USPTO. Why we need to go our own way. I mean, that's a whole different conversation. Let's just say that we think we can do better, and we do. What the stars are bringing is really interesting, right? So one of the things that Sagar didn't have time to go into is to actually look at the patents that are being generated and the science that we cite, right? And we do see at least some evidence that the stars are bringing in some ability to cite the science that they were working on when they were being mentored by the star scientists. And this idea about comparing people, who establish their quality through performance via benchmarks, as opposed to being mentored by a star scientist, relates to a whole series of extensions that we're working on, right? I mean, the great thing about working on this stuff now, as opposed to when Zucker and Darby were doing it, is that we've got data sets like Revilio. Right? So rather than wholly relying on measures like patenting and publication to track the movement of elite or specialized human capital across firms or locate them in firms, now we've got much, much more data, right? So we're trying to establish the fact that these people possibly matter, but of course other groups matter a lot. And with the data richness now that we have, we can actually kind of map out the whole ecology of different skill sets within these firms and how they're working together to create AI or not. And that seems like a really promising direction in which to head. And I really like the idea of the chick coming out of the egg, so maybe we'll borrow that image from you. Thanks so much. You want to add anything, Sarah?
I think Leah's almost covered all the points. I'll briefly mention 3 things. One is shocks. So we are also exploring the exogenous shocks. So in terms of 1996, IBM defeating, Kasparov. We have 2012 ImageNet paper. So all the series of these exogenous shocks and whether the effects still sustain. Is there a correlation? Can we go towards causal identification? So that's one point. We also talked about ideas. So we are exploring meme tracing as well. So we are utilizing AI pattern description text and the ideas that are being generated, whether it's a taxonomy, whether it's a foundational new algorithm, and whether that's being traced across different innovations, different patents. So that's another exploration that we're working on. And lastly, joint co-authorship with Immortals. I think there was one question. So the frontier scientists directly co-author with the firms and or with their students before these students graduate or even after graduating. So how does that entire pipeline actually work is what we are also exploring. So whether everything would be in one paper, most probably not. We'll have multiple papers. But yeah, thanks for questions. Happy to discuss it afterwards as well. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Just to make some closing remarks and thank you. So digitization, our digitization family, cousins, will continue with exciting things to come. But this also concludes the innovation part of the program. So Heidi and I definitely want to just thank everyone, all of our authors and presenters, all of our discussants, all of our audience members who asked such great questions. But also, our AV support, Rob Shannon and the whole NBER team that has, makes all this possible and does a lot of lifting behind the scenes. So thank you very much to all of them and to all of you for a great couple of days.
And let's just make sure we give thanks to our organizers too.